Thank you very much. It is both a pleasure and an honour to be here. And when I looked at the agenda for tonight, I was reminded of an event just about 2 years ago, when I was at a meeting of the Christian churches in London. It was part of the last mayoral election campaign. I was there with Boris Johnson, the Lib Dem, Brian Paddock, the Green candidate, and we were answering questions from representatives of the Christian churches. And Brian Paddock, the Liberal candidate, at one point in answering a question said, "You have to understand, Islam is a peaceful religion." And there were murmurs of dissent. What he had said was clearly unpopular and disbelieved by many of the people present. Fortunately, I was the next person to speak, and I've become prepared and used to that sort of response when you have a meeting which is of people who are not of Muslim origin. And so at all my meetings, I always carry with me 2 quotes from the last sermon of the Prophet. That last sermon that he delivered, knowing that his time was coming to an end. And in that last sermon, he spells out how humanity should live side by side. And so after those murmurs of dissent and disapproval, I read to those Christians the words of the Prophet, where he says, "No Arab has superiority over a non-Arab, nor any non-Arab superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, and a black has no superiority over a white." He goes on to say that God formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another, not so that you may fight or oppress or occupy or convert or terrorize, but so that you may get to know one another. And the whole audience burst into applause. And that was always the response at any meeting, whether it was of Muslims, Christians, atheists, whatever. They were all so enlightened and infused by those words, because those words have absolute relevance to how we live our lives today. Here was a man over 1,000 years ago foretelling a code about how we should live, absolutely as relevant today as the day he delivered it. And what was striking was the number of people who came up to me at the end of that meeting and said, "That is amazing. I must go and read that whole sermon." And I asked myself, how many non-Muslims in Britain have ever heard those words? Have ever even heard that there was a last sermon? I spent my entire childhood in school. Never once was the name of the Prophet Muhammad ever mentioned. We were never taught anything. Even when I became a politician, I was ignorant on a vast scale about the meaning of Islam and its history. And that is why it is so easy for those who wish to divide us and spread fear and hatred to succeed, because they are talking to people who have never been told the truth about Islam. There was a survey about 4 years ago conducted by a unit at the University of Cardiff. They read all the British newspapers published between 2000 and 2008. Now, that is a task, a punishment I wouldn't inflict on anyone. But they found that 2/3 of all the stories in all our papers in those 8 years were negative about Islam, portraying it as a threat or a problem or both. I wouldn't mind betting that if I could steel myself to go and read 8 years of British newspapers, not once would I find a reference to the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad. And that is why it is so important that as we gather at meetings like this, we don't forget as we walk out that we have done what we came here to do. It's what we say, it's how we educate, it's how we spread the truth when we are not at meetings like this, in our day-to-day lives, in the things we say as we meet others, in the things we write on the internet and whatever. And it is a huge task that is ahead of us. If you think back to 2011, when the terrorist Anders Breivik killed 77 people in Norway, and as he went to kill mainly those children, he published on the internet his personal manifesto. If you read that horrific document, it is filled with quotes from British newspapers demonising Islam. It is filled with quotes from the journalist Melanie Phillips, who wrote for the Daily Mail for many years and published a book called Londonistan, saying that we had been taken over by Muslims, we were a centre for Muslim terrorism. The hatred she perpetrated on an almost daily basis in the Daily Mail sank into his heart and mind and fueled his acts of horrific murder against innocent Norwegian boys and girls. Nor is it just one or two embittered people. Following the killing of those 77 Norwegians, the former Prime Minister, Mr. Jagland, who is now the chair of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, warned that we have to stop talking about Islamic terrorism because it helps to demonize Islam. And we need to recognize that the vast majority of terrorist acts that happen here in this continent happen by right-wing groups, extremists from the far right. He also said, and particularly mentioned, our own Prime Minister, David Cameron, warning that his message helped stir up hatred against Muslims. If you look at the work that was done by George Soros, the billionaire, a few years ago, he commissioned in 2011 a study of Muslims in each European country. And it is quite revealing. One of the questions they asked Muslims in the different European countries is, do you feel a part of your country? In France, they were asked, do you feel that you are French? Here, do you feel that you are British? The results of that study were quite revealing. Only 1 Muslim in 4 in Germany felt that they were also a German. Only 1 in 2 felt in France that they were French. I was very proud to read that 9 out of 10 Muslims in Britain feel that they are British. They have no problem living their life as a Muslim and living their life as a British person. And I look at this city, apart from New York, the most diverse on earth. Every faith, every ethnic group, every nationality gathered together. And when we had those terrible bombings in July 2005, we saw the response of Londoners. The week after the bombing, we had a service in Trafalgar Square. I was able to say that in the week of that bombing, there had been no recorded incident of an attack on a Muslim Londoner. Londoners knew that terrorist attack sought to divide us. They refused to be divided. That is a legacy of the teachings of the Prophet in that last sermon. When you look at why this has happened, the Ayatollah just spoke about the legacy of invasions, the American and British and French invasions of Muslim lands over many decades. Everything he said was true. There's even more. One could go on all night about what we have done. But there are two phases to this. In that period after the First World War, and right up really to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the real driving force for Western imperialism and its interventions in whether it was Egypt or the overthrow of the government of Iran in 1953, all these interventions were about the control of oil. But then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was another dimension. And we saw it in the book published by the American academic Samuel P. Huntington in 1996. The book was called The Clash of Civilizations. And in that book, he spelled out an inevitable clash between the West and Islam. It set the political agenda for the intolerant right for the decades that followed. And it is wrong, and it is dishonest. And why was this taken up so eagerly by American presidents like George W. Bush? Because America had a vast economy based on its military machine. Half of all the military spending on earth is by one nation, the United States of America. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, you couldn't justify vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons, hundreds of bases around the world. You needed a new enemy, and that's what Huntington gave. And we have to challenge this. One of the final acts of George W. Bush in the last year of his presidency was to put $300 million into the hands of terrorist groups to allow them to undertake terrorist attacks inside Iran. Sadly, President Obama did not cancel that program. How many people who read a British paper reading about terrorism read the truth about what the West has done and what America has done so often? We know now the hundreds of billions of pounds that were spent funding Iraq to invade Iran in the 1980s. We need to tell people the truth, both the truth about what Islam really stands for, but also what lies behind this demonization of Islam today. Finally, I just want to say this. When we look at that sermon as a way in which we live our lives, I think as we look around London, we are living our lives according to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. We are tolerant. We do accept difference and diversity. But there's an even more striking example of the power of his message of peace and love. In the 1300 years following his death, from Morocco to Iran, every Muslim nation had in it a strong and vibrant Jewish community, free to practice its faith, accepted and tolerated, not threatened, not evicted. Where was Judaism a victim? By the Christian king of Spain, who expelled the Jews from Spain. By the Christian king of England, who expelled the Jews from England. Across much of the Christian world, Jews were victimized and expelled. In the Muslim world, the legacy of that prophet, the prophet's last sermon, actually guaranteed peace and harmony between Jew and Muslim. And that was, of course, shattered by the war of 1948, a tragic event. That is the legacy of the prophet. I, as you may have guessed, am not a Muslim, but I don't have any doubt whatsoever. I have no problems saying that I've tried to live my life as he left his message, being tolerant, accepting diversity, and being proud of that difference. It's why I'm proud to be a Londoner. I'm proud to be amongst you tonight. Thank you.